Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. Today's guest is Blair Sheppard, and he is the global leader of strategy and leadership at PwC, also former dean at the Fuqua School of Business, former Duke Corporate Education CEO, and author of a brand new book called 10 Years to Midnight, 4 Urgent Global Crises and Their Strategic Solutions. Blair, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, you're welcome to be here.
So you have done a lot of really cool stuff over the years, which I want to dive into. But why don't we go way back to how you got started with all this stuff, becoming dean, joining PwC. Where did this all begin?
Well, it actually began with me dropping out of university and debating what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, and then realizing that actually education was kind of the thing I was most worried about at the time. And so I went back, got a PhD, joined the system, and did all the things you would do through that. And I've sort of been, up until this role at PwC, I would think of myself mostly as an educational innovator. This was a shift, and a really fun shift. I wish I'd realized how much fun it could be being outside the mainstream education business.
So you dropped out of university because you were not sure what you wanted to do?
Exactly. Yeah, I took a year, was in honors physics. You don't want to know what my grades were in 3 of the courses. And then I just said, I'm not serious. I ought to figure it out. So I went to work in a steel mill. And there's a guy I met there who said, we became really close friends. We worked together in pretty nasty job, and we would go drinking every Friday. And he, about halfway through the year, he looked at me and said, I'm just sick and tired of it. Don't talk to me about what's wrong with education. I'm going to go back and become part of the system and fix it. So I owe him this career, actually.
Wow. So I guess while you were working there, you had all these ideas of education and why it's broken, and you were complaining about it, and he's like, stop whining, just go do something about it.
Go do something about it. Exactly. And thus I am where I am.
Very cool. Was that the first job you ever had?
No, actually, I paid my way through college, right? So I was a lifeguard. I picked tobacco. I did all the things. I did whatever I could do to pay my way through college. And actually, I started working at 16. It was legal in Canada at the time. So I took my first job as a lifeguard at 16.
Wow. And how did you go from all of that to joining the Fuqua School of Business?
So I did a PhD at University of Illinois. Finished that, met my wife, went to McGill and taught at McGill for a year. It was the height of the anti-English sentiment, so she wasn't going to find a job in Montreal. So we looked at places to get a job, and she got employed at University of North Carolina. And so I applied to Fuqua, and they had gone through a round of people to hire and didn't like anybody. So I was in the second round and got hired and been there the rest of my life, except for the job at PwC.
Very cool. Well, PwC is not a bad place to be.
Not bad at all.
So for people not familiar with PwC, maybe you can give us a little bit of background information about PwC as a company, and what do you do there at PwC?
So we are one of the world's largest professional services firm. Networks, actually. We're a federated structure. You could sort of think of us as the corporate equivalent of the UN, where every country is its own entity, but we aggregate up. We're the largest collection of accountants in the world. We're the largest tax practice in the world, and then do a host of other advisory work that you'd expect a consulting firm to do. And when I left Fuqua, it was the chairman then who said, we need someone to put 2 things together for us. You need to help us think about how to create a sharper global strategy, because the world's getting weirder and we need some help. But then you've got to help us think about how to build the leaders to make that happen. And so it was the combination of those 2 together, which is, you rarely get strategy and capability building at the same time. And so that's why I took the job. It's been a great job and a wonderful firm to work for. Just wonderful people with serious integrity.
Yep. And we were talking before I pushed record. I had the opportunity to do some work with PwC. Big fan of the company as well, and some of the work that you guys are doing. So as someone who is leading strategy and leadership, what does your responsibility entail? Is this internally or customer facing?
It's internal. My job's internal. So it is ensuring that we have it's really sort of stepping back and saying, what's going on in the world that's changing the nature of the context for our clients and for the societies we're part of? And therefore, what does that mean we need to be doing as an organization to be more responsive? And then helping craft the strategy. Now, it turns out in a federated structure, no one creates a strategy. You kind of collectively agree on it, really. All right. And then ensure that we have the leaders who can actually execute on it, and that we have the leaders we need. We're building the leaders we need for 5 or 10 years from now, rather than the leaders we need today, because they're going to emerge then. And so it's the forward-looking piece is really an important part of the job.
Okay. Well, obviously, there's a lot going on today with COVID, with Black Lives Matter, with the social and racial injustice that's going on. Can you talk a little bit about how that has impacted maybe some of the work that you're doing on leadership? Because I would imagine it's like a big right hook that just came at you guys.
Actually, that was all knowable, really, right? So all it did was accelerate. So we had been looking since really around 2015 at sort of the kind of gritty, nasty things that were going on in the world. And we identified a set of things that we said, these are really pretty serious, and they're getting more serious every day. So what really happened with COVID and sort of things like Black Lives Matter, Wall Street Sit-in, Me Too, is that they just accelerated something that we were already looking at, and gave them more teeth, and so people are listening to it more. It's easier to do my job because I have to persuade people to pay attention. It's a lot to get their attention today, but it's none of this is surprising. It was knowable well before it happened.
Oh wow! Even COVID?
Yeah, I mean, it turns out if you look at sort of the training they do for the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, one of the things they'll spend a lot of time on with that person is, are we ready for the next pandemic? Right. And so, yeah, it was noble.
Wow.
That wasn't one of the things we focused on in the work we did. But what it really did was accelerate all the other things we were talking about and made them much more urgent, much more important.
How do you think things like COVID are changing the world of work, if at all?
So I think COVID's doing two things, and then the economic decisions we took in response to COVID is doing a third, right? So the first is it's accelerating the things that are already happening. So for example, we were already moving to a platform-based world, right? I mean, the kind of conversation we're having now, right? That's being done on a platform that has massive ubiquity around the world. We're already moving to that. COVID just made it, sort of pushed it over a cliff and made it come way faster, right? We were already worried about the institutions in our country and what wasn't working, and COVID just made it worse, right? We already had massive disparity. COVID just made it worse. So in some ways, what COVID did was accelerate trends that were already occurring and made them more acute. The second thing, though, that happened is that it added a layer of its own problems, right? So think about kind of three examples of that. One of them is that unless you were lucky enough to be in the right kind of business, your balance sheet's probably pretty bloody right now, right?
Yeah.
National debt's ridiculous. There's a set of people who we've really harmed. So think about the person who had two jobs and was barely subsisting, or might have actually, been someone who had an addiction and were solving it, but they need to get the antidote every day. And that kind of person, what happened is because of delay in the mail or because they lost their job, we just push them off a cliff. And so it's created a whole new class of people who are really pretty desperate. And then I think the third thing it did was sort of just decimate small business, and which is really a worrisome thing because it's a key to the answer to many of the challenges we have in the future. So it's a big deal.
Yeah, small businesses have been completely just massacred, which is very, very unfortunate to see.
Yes.
So you mentioned that there are a couple, like I think in 2015 you mentioned there were some things that you were paying attention to. What were those things that you were already looking at?
So it started actually with a conversation with my then new boss, the new chairman. where he said, the world's gotten gritty. Let's go find out what's going on. So we interviewed people in about 60 countries, government leaders, head of business, just, people around a coffee table. And I'd listen to cab drivers and conversation in coffee shops. And what we found was the whole world was worried about exactly the same things. Right. And so we then started researching it. And here's what came up. There's enough disparity in the world, and there's enough people who are put at disadvantage because of that what occurs is they say, I don't think my kid's future, my own future is going to be as good. So think about 50% of the retirees in the United States are going to retire with basically no savings and no pension.
That's crazy. I didn't know the number was that high.
Kids graduating from college with $1.5 trillion in debt, with a huge tax obligation we just created for them, right? And then people who have a job and a mortgage and a kid in school who are likely to lose that job, right, and have to transition. That group are now collectively saying, I'm really worried about the future. And when people stop believing in the future, they stop dreaming, creating, developing. So we call that sort of the crisis of prosperity. The second one is essentially because technology is everywhere, its harms are a population level problem. So two examples, right? One of them is the people who created social media never meant that the fastest growing cause of death among 16-year-old males would be suicide, or that girls would self-harm way more than they were. Right. And because it's everywhere, it's not just a few kids that are doing that. It's a whole population that is at risk of those issues. Right. The other one is that when we created the Industrial Revolution, we forgot that carbon was a byproduct. Right. And that actually, because it's now in the atmosphere, it could completely undo the whole system. And so the issue we're describing there is the growing unintended consequences of ubiquitous technology. The third one is sort of sheer inability to lead because the world is so fractured, so polarized. And then the final one is, if you take those three and put them together, we just don't trust the institutions anymore. We don't trust the police force. We don't trust the tax system to be doing taxes fairly. We don't believe we're graduating the students we need. And that's the one that worries me the most, by the way, because as soon as you stop trusting the institutions that make our life work, it's sort of like a fish not trusting water.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work. And so the worry we have is that they're all pretty serious right now, but if we don't get our arms around them in a decade, they become really ugly. All four of them become really ugly.
So maybe we can talk about each of these four just for a few minutes. So why don't we start off with the prosperity one?
Sure.
So you mentioned that one of the challenges that a lot of people who are retiring without savings. A lot of people who are in college have tons of debt. So, okay, so that's kind of like something that's macro, that's impacting the world. How does this impact you as an organization, or how does this impact other leaders in organizations who are leading employees?
Yeah, so there are a few ways that it has a significant impact. So one of them is that there's going to be much greater pressure on companies to sort of show that they are not creating those harms, right? And so you're going to have huge reporting on compensation and fairness in compensation. There's going to be real pressure on, are you harming social mobility or helping it, right? Are you part of the problem or not? So one of them is just the public pressure, and actually the reporting that's going to be required of that, right? One of the things that we're going to have to help our clients with is reporting on that. Second one, which I think is bigger, is actually we're bifurcating the world. Right. And so there's a set of people who can buy really, really, really expensive, amazing things, who tend not to buy, right? The amount of money that a wealthy person spends consuming relative to their total wealth is way less than the same number of people, the same amount of money distributed across the middle class. And then a host of people who have less and less and less capacity to consume. So essentially, business is eating its tail by creating that disparity, right? And then the other one is that we're going to have sort of people who aren't prepared. And so there's going to be a really interesting thing, which is we're going to have huge needs for certain kinds of employees and a tremendous surfeit of others. And so this would be an ironic thing of large unemployment, but we won't have the people we need for work. And so we have to fix all three of those. There's a workforce issue, there's a customer issue, and there's a societal pressure issue that comes from that one.
So as a leader, and you're doing this internally. So what do you do as a result? Is this just about, you pay your employees more and you treat them more fairly? You focus on upskilling and retraining your workforce? You just kind of put these programs in place and then you can say that that's solved?
No, I mean, it turns out the issue I just described is a societal level issue. We can't solve it ourselves, right? So the first thing is we spend a lot of time asking, what's our purpose? And, and we did this really seriously, right? So we sort of said, given who we are, if you think about what I described as our core business, what should our purpose be? And we concluded we've got two jobs, really. One of them is to build trust in society, and the second one is to help people solve important problems. So if you think about the way we address it externally, it's sort of working with our clients with that purpose in mind, or working with our society with that purpose in mind, right? So, for example, you mentioned Tim Ryan earlier, the head of U.S. firm. He's sort of brought together a host of CEOs from around the United States to focus on diversity. It did it before Black Lives Matter came out, but it's really urgent now. And so work with our clientele and work with the other actors in the world to address those questions. And then we have to make sure we don't live in a glass house, right? So to your point about if we really believe that technology is leaving people behind, we better be investing in making our own people technically capable, right? And we're spending billions of dollars on that question just to bring people up to speed. And actually, we invited you to help us on that, as you just told me before this started. So it's a pretty serious. So we have both an internal issue and a need to work with our clients and society at large, and we're doing all three. Okay. We're trying to facilitate because essentially it's a big set of issues.
So for those who are listening to this podcast, who are trying to figure out what they can be doing internally around prosperity, are there some specific tips or action items that you recommend that leaders around the world start taking?
Yeah. So let me do the cause of the four issues and then come back to that for a minute.
Okay.
What really made it happen, if you think about it, is we built this very smart, simple model after the Second World War that created 70 years of prosperity, right? And it really was, globalization is great. Technology is generally good for life. And let's have simple measures of success, GDP and shareholder value. Those fixed the world essentially as a thought process. They brought 2 billion people out of poverty, and they allowed us to incorporate massive countries into the global economy. The problem is they're wrong in their simplicity. So globalization stops working when you have enough places in the world that are too far behind, or enough people in the world that are too far behind. Now, it turns out the reason for that is globalization itself isn't bad. It's because we had this single measure of success, GDP. We didn't see that West Virginia was falling behind. We didn't see that a whole bunch of people were dropping out of the middle class because we saw the economic success that was happening in the United States, for example, right? And so, and we didn't know that technology was essentially a thing that left people behind, in particular in the global world. So the first thing we have to do is step back and say, as we want to fix any of these four, but prosperity in particular, we have to rethink that model and make it a little more complicated. So while we're focused on being global competitors, we also have to help create thriving local communities.
Yeah.
Right? While we're measuring GDP, we have to look at economic dispersion, how well the whole economy is doing, how well everyone's doing, and other measures of social well-being, not just financial, right? And while we're driving technology, we've got to say, have we thought about the unintended consequence of the thing we're building? It's sort of like the way we do drug development, right? Which is, does it really do what it says it should, and what are the side effects? So in part, we have to shift entirely the way we think about what we do and what it means to be successful. That's the biggest part of the story, right?
Okay.
And what I just described is a pretty serious exercise.
Definitely not easy. Okay, so that's the prosperity piece. Let's jump to the tech piece, because this is a huge topic of conversation, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence, when it comes to robotic process automation. Although lately, I think some of the conversations have died down around that as a result of COVID, and it's shifted quite a bit. But I fully expect that once we get through this, those conversations are going to be right back front and center: automation, technology, jobs. So what are you seeing in that space?
So there's some clusters that matter, right? So one of them is, what's it doing to work, right? And there's this huge debate. We even have it inside PwC about, are there going to be more jobs or fewer jobs in the future? What we all know is that the transition is going to be really hard.
Yeah.
Right. You think about the Industrial Revolution. We were great on the back end, but we had a pretty tough transition. Same thing's going to occur, right? A lot of people losing jobs and having to find new ones. The other piece is essentially the ways in which information aggregation at scale and AI does things like violate privacy, does things like put control in too few hands, does things like actually make decisions in a way that we can't understand, and therefore we don't know what really is at the heart of the decision, right? So you're getting about that as large-scale analytics and AI. And then the other one is sort of the unintended side effects that of the ones I described earlier, like what it does for us as individuals. But two more that I think are important in this is, we're polarizing our society. It was never intended, right? And the other sort of interesting piece is, in some ways, are getting dumber. Right? So our short-term memory and our attention span are shrinking. Now, here's the scary part about that one, by the way. The part of the human brain that's least well advanced are those two pieces, and they're no better than a chimp. So in a kind of ironic way, the most important part of the brain for doing execution, for making things happen, is actually getting dumber than a chimp.
Jeez, don't scare me, Blair.
Yeah, right. So that's technology, right? Really, really, really good, but some pretty serious negative side effects.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's funny. I sometimes even notice like the impact that technology just has on my personal life, and I notice that I'm doing something just out of habit. I'm like, wait a minute, like why am I even, like, you don't even understand sometimes the impact that it has to your attention. Like, how hard is it nowadays to just sit without a phone? And sometimes my wife will call me out on it. She's like, why don't you just sit here and be bored with me? Like, stop doing chess puzzles, put away your freaking phone, stop reading, like, just be a freaking, just be here. And I mean, I see people walking their dogs in my neighborhood with headphones on, looking at their phones. It's insane.
And accidents are going up as a result. Pedestrian-based accidents are going up as a result of that. It turns out, because we have big trucks with large fronts, right, and people with their head down, we have a lot more pedestrian deaths happening. So, I do think there's an important point in what you said, though, which is a lot of the answer is good discipline on our part, right? We don't have to be dumber. We're just letting ourselves become that, right? We don't have to fracture. We're just letting ourselves become that. So but it's scary if we don't do something about it.
Internally, you mentioned that you guys keep having this debate around will technology create more jobs or replace more jobs? Who's winning that debate so far? Is it job creation, or?
It's about 50-50. I mean, I do think that everyone agrees that the transition is going to be really hard. And for a couple of groups in particular, those who have been in a career for a long time, in their late 40s or early 50s, and have to make a massive shift, and those who are already behind, who just aren't technology capable, those two groups are really going to have a tough transition problem. The other thing on is
those two groups really quick one more time. So you said people who are in their 40s?
Well, people who have been doing the same kind of job for a long time and been really successful at it, but lose the job and have to transition. Because
it's going to be blue or white collar?
Career. Yeah, blue collar, all of the above. It's happening to white collar as much as blue collar now. And then the other one is people who never were in the technology game and have to catch up. Right.
Okay. So what advice do you have? Because I know there are a lot of people who are listening to this who have been, they're in their 40s, they've been at the same company for a while. Maybe they've been there a decade or more. Or there are a lot of people actually even who are not as tech savvy, as digitally fluent as they should be. And they're, probably a little freaked out. Do you have any advice or suggestions for what they should be doing?
Yeah, there's some basic stuff. So one of them is, stop thinking about a career as a vector, as a single line, and think of it as actually jumping from platform to platform to platform. So find a job that's interesting, that pays well, but teaches you forward-looking skills, and it has options on the back end. And then just think about living your life in chapters rather than as a vector. I was a a PhD student, assistant professor, associate professor, professor, dean. Stop thinking that way, because the world's not going to work like that, right? The second piece is find yourself in the place or adjacent to the people who do the thing you want to become. So one of the mistakes is people essentially retool themselves, but in a place where they're not interacting with the opportunity set, right? So get adjacent to the opportunity set, which is easier to do in an electronic world, by the way, right? Third one is actually be really smart. So what a lot of people are doing that I worry about is they're doing an incremental move in an industry that's probably in some real trouble in the long run. Make a move before it's too late.
How do you know if you should make a move?
Think about forward-looking trends. Read our book. We just studied, listen to you actually probably, and sort of think about forward-looking trends, and then say, okay, I kind of get that the thing I'm doing is in some risk, and maybe I ought to be thinking about something different, and migrate before it's too late. The problem is it's sort of like parents looking for support for their kids right now, just as school isn't opening up. Probably should have thought about it 6 months ago.
Yeah. It's funny because I think a lot of people don't do a good enough job of looking at their careers from that kind of future perspective. They're just kind of heads down what's right in front of us.
Right.
You also mentioned an interesting point of being next to the opportunity set.
Yes.
Because I think the other thing that a lot of people do is they're very good at surrounding themselves by people who are just like them.
Yes.
Same skill set, same mindset, same job, same role. I'm in marketing, I'm going to hang out with other marketing people. I'm in sales, I hang out with other salespeople. And so by doing that, you're not actually necessarily helping yourself, because you're just going to be in the same boat with everybody else when something bad happens.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's also bad.
Oh. You're muted.
Can you hear me?
There you go. Sorry, I don't know what happened there, but maybe you can repeat what you just said.
What occurred here?
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Can you hear?
I can hear you, yes. Can you hear me, Blair?
How's that?
I can hear you. I can hear you.
What just happened?
1 second, everyone. The challenges of doing something.
How's it?
I can hear you. Hello? Man, we were just getting into the good stuff. Can you hear me now? So you guys can all hear me, and we can all hear Blair, but Blair cannot hear me. That's what we're trying to figure out. Let's see if this helps. Hello, I can't hear you. Nope.
Can you hear okay?
I can hear you now.
Good. I'm sorry. I just shifted earphones and mic. I apologize for that.
No worries. We'll edit that part out later. And those of you who are watching live, sorry about that. But you were just in the middle of making like this awesome point when that happened.
Sorry. Can you remind me where we were? I was stressed trying to fix this mic. So where?
No, we were talking about just surrounding yourself by people who are like you.
Yeah.
And why is why that's a challenge. And you should kind of broaden.
So here's the thing that's important in this, and it relates to one of our other crises, which is in times as stressful as these, what happens is you tend to actually close in, right? You are more likely to hang out with people like yourself. And one of the challenges with being stuck at home is that you have, you're even more likely. So for example, we have a multi-generational household right now. 4 PhDs and 1 triple degree. That's a pretty bad thing for trying to understand how the whole world's working, right? And so I think you have to really work to get outside your own domain and understand the world better, and get exposed to opportunities. Great.
Okay.
Point.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. So surround yourself by people who are not like you. Broaden your, and like you said, with technology, it's never been easier to do that.
Exactly. Exactly. And then I think the other one is get curious and start learning.
Yeah.
Right? Yep.
And again, with technology, that's never been easier because you can learn pretty much anything that you need nowadays. Okay, so we covered two. The next one is more around kind of the inability to lead.
Yes.
So what are you seeing there?
So there's really sort of two sides to the problem, right? One of them is it's harder to lead. So because of polarization, you have way more constituents you have to appeal to who tend to have conflicting views, and they just don't accept the other view very well, right? People don't trust leaders very much today. If you take a look at any of the surveys, our trust in leadership is as low as it's been for a long, long time. And then the other piece is that the problems are more complicated. So you've got to solve a more complicated problem that's more urgent with a set of people who don't agree with each other, but you got to get all the points of view, and they don't believe you in the first place, right? So that's the problem's hard. And then on the other side, we've prepared the wrong kind of leader, right? So we have leaders good for the world that we were in that I described earlier, but we actually need leaders for the world we're in today. And it's a very different kind of leader. They need to, the core difference is a leader today needs to figure out how to reconcile things that feel contradictory.
Yeah. Yeah. If only there was a book that was aimed at looking at the future leader. For those of you who are listening, I was just jokingly holding up my book. So that's exactly
Good book, by the way. It's a really good book.
I mean, that's exactly why I wrote it, right? Because a lot of people were asking the same question. The general consensus was like, we get kind of what's going on in the world now, but we want to know how things are changing because there's a lot of weird stuff happening and we're not ready for it.
Yeah, agree.
So, I mean, internally, I think you guys are also doing some cool stuff on this, right? I mean, how are you preparing your leaders for this new world?
So one of the things we're trying to do, one of the things that we are really, really good at is bringing particular expertise to bear against a specific problem, right? It turns out the challenge is that our clients' problems are increasingly aggregated, right? They're more complicated. And so we're doing a host of things, but a few in particular. One is we're trying to help the people who are facing off against our clients to have a deeper and better appreciation of the larger world in which our client's behaving, and then be able to have kind of a conversation around this. We're looking at a crystal ball and it's kind of fuzzy. How do we clarify that crystal ball? That's a very different conversation from what we're used to. And as an example, you would never have expected PwC to author the book we're talking about today. Right. But it's trying to get us to understand where's the world going and how do we do that. Second one is we are trying to upskill everybody for a technology-based world. The hardest of those is actually getting the leaders ready because the people who are leading grew up in the television generation, right? And so working with them to what does it mean to lead a group like the ones we have today is the more difficult task. And then I think the final thing is the point I raised earlier, which is we're reminding everybody and getting everyone to sort of think deeply about what our purpose is and therefore go back to fundamentals. Because a thing that's interesting, if you want to innovate, you have to be sure you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Therefore, you better know what matters, what your core is, and then change everything else, right? And so we're trying to get people to remember the core and then think about how you innovate on all other things but that.
So you mentioned that you have some programs internally in place, and I think people would be really interested to learn about them. I know one of them is the Digital Accelerator program.
Yes.
Which maybe we can talk about briefly, because although I talked to Tim Ryan about this, and also your chief digital officer, Joe, I forgot his last name, but he was your chief digital officer. But we talked about this like 2 years ago, so a lot of people might be familiar with it. So can you share some of the programs that you guys have going on internally, like the Digital Accelerator program?
Yeah, actually, so think of them as layered, right? So basically, everyone in the organization is being asked to become more digitally capable, right? And it starts with a pretty simple instrument. We basically, we're all given an assessment, right? And in that assessment, you learn where you're strong and where you're weak and where you need to add capability. And it gets updated, right? So it turns out that if you were good 6 months ago, you're probably not good today if you haven't been investing. And so there's this continuous digital assessment. And we're all expected to do that. Then there's another layer, which is a set of people who actually are going to be the ones who help us get there faster, which is the program you were describing, right? Digital accelerators. And these are people who are taken off stream for a period of time, given some real intense learning, and then put back against client teams and client problems, and help update our capacity there with the learning we've done with the broad group. And then they're brought back in and they're taken out to the field, and they're brought back in, they're taken out to the field. So they're continuously learning pieces of capability and then making it relevant. And what we've done since we've talked to you, I suspect, is built a whole set of capacity around that. So one of the arguments that Tim emphasizes a lot is citizen-led. Mm-hmm. Well, it's hard to have our youngest and our most diverse people contributing if we don't have a place to collect it, evaluate it, and then distribute it, right? So we've essentially created our own marketplace and our own collection of materials that supports it. So we've built the infrastructure to support the education at the same time. It's a massive investment and working really well.
Yeah. And so you say massive investment. Can you give people a context? Are we talking like $1 million, $2 million?
Globally, over a period of time, into the billions.
Wow. Okay. So you guys are clearly putting a lot of time and effort and resources behind this.
Yeah. We're kind of betting the farm on digitizing the firm. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess for your role, since you are leading a lot of the strategy and leadership stuff, do you work kind of like one-on-one with different leaders, or do you create these programs for them to take, or both?
Both. Okay. Right. So the thing to think about is my job is global, right? And so the real responsibility for developing the talent in the firm sits at a country level. And so Tim Ryan, who you described, is actually the senior partner for the United States, right? And then we have a senior partner for 156 other countries in the world, right? And so the expectation is that the core development will be done by those territories. And our job is to essentially ensure that the thought processes are in place and the architecture is in place to allow that to happen. What I spend the majority of my time worrying about are the people who actually are going to be, who have a job that has global responsibility. That doesn't mean they're in a global role. It could be the CFO in the United States, for example, but the decisions taken there matter to the whole world, right? And so we worry about do we have the most senior leadership necessary to run the firm? But we also worry about, do we have the thought processes in place? So PwC Professional, which is kind of the architecture we use for describing what we're looking for in people, we were sort of essential in creating that, making that get created in the first place. So it's thought leadership and then a few people.
Do you, like when you're working with individuals, is it like a coaching relationship, or how do you work with them?
Well,
say, hey Blair, I'm trying to, become a better global leader. Or like, how does the relationship go?
So think of it from a couple of standpoints. First of all, you've got to identify. Right. Yeah. So there's an administrative function involved in it, right? Which is working with territories to say, what are the sorts of things we're looking for forward-looking leaders? Who are they? You track them. You make sure that they're given interesting opportunities. You make sure that they're stretched the way they should stretch. So there's a job element to it, right? And then there is sort of individual coaching, and there's programmatic activity, both. The most fun is actually working with the individuals one-on-one. The biggest impact is obviously the stuff we do programmatically. What's kind of nice, by the way, now is you can do some pretty serious scale really fast. So to give you an example, the most recent thing we did, when we were thinking about it in January before COVID, we said, well, we'll probably do this in 3 months with a fair bit of money put behind it. We actually, after COVID, put it together in 3 weeks and spent virtually nothing. And it's probably better, by the way. So it's the capacity to do impactful things quickly just went up a lot.
Yeah, no, for sure. Okay, so for people listening to this who are thinking of how they can coach their leaders, you said thought process is also another critical aspect that you work on. So what kind of goes into that? How do you change that for leaders? Or do you have some leaders who just like don't get it and you need to?
Yeah, so I think there's a few pieces, right? One of them is what I was describing earlier about this job, which is in today's world, you can't sort of separate strategy from leadership or strategy from execution, right? And so you have to work with people to think about how they repair the damage of COVID and rethink where they need to be in order to reposition the firm and understand at a kind of firm-wide level or a function level, whatever the responsibility is, but then say, what does that mean for you? And really force them to pose the question, what are the requisites of a leader if this is what we're trying to do as an organization? Right? And then I think the other piece is sort of point out the paradoxes in that, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the things that we've been talking about with regard to ourselves and all of our clients is the need to become way more technology savvy. Well, it turns out, remember I said one of the crises is the unintended consequence of technology. So you've got to be technology savvy and a humanist at the same time.
Yeah.
And so the issue is you can't just focus on the one. So you got to think about the complement, right? You've got to figure out how to bring a bunch of very diverse people together, like we talked about before, but you got to do that in a way that actually reinforces your integrity, makes you even more trustworthy and more clear about your purpose. You've got to actually have the humility to seek a lot of input, but actually the courage to take the decision, even though it's completely ambiguous what the right answer is, right? And so it turns out that the issue you want to get people to reflect on is, which of those am I weak on? You know, am I weak on seeking input, or am I weak on having courage? Am I weak on and actually recognize? We used to say to leaders, build on strength, and I think that's still true. But now actually you've got to mitigate your weakness, because the other side of the paradox is just as important as the side that you're strong on.
So one of the things that I talk about is the mindset of the chef, where
yes.
The two ingredients that you balance are the technology and the humanity aspect.
Yes, yes.
Balance just right. Otherwise, the dish goes all out of whack.
Exactly. I mean, I think that in a sense, you do a wonderful job of describing what I would call tech-savvy humanist, right? There are 5 other paradoxes that you've got to resolve.
Yeah.
That was a tough one, though, because, you know, in a sense, if you're technically savvy, you probably have a double E degree or computer science or math, and you probably didn't study psychology, sociology, and history. If you study psychology, sociology, and history, you probably didn't take computer science. And so we actually need people who can put those things together, because if they can't, if you're just a humanist and you don't have technical capability, you're irrelevant.
Yeah.
But if you're a technologist and you don't understand people, you're going to create things that actually do harm, like I described earlier. So you got to put them together. Now, I'm actually speaking to the master of that argument, so I probably don't need to go any further. People have heard this a lot from you, but let me just reinforce it's really important.
Oh, yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. So we have maybe a couple minutes left, I think 15 minutes left. So let's jump to the next one really quick, which is around trust, unless there's anything else that you want to touch on for inability to lead.
No, that was, so the trust issue is, if you take 3 things I just described, right, you can understand why there's not trust.
Yeah.
And so the scary data is that 4/5 of the population in the world, as surveyed by Edelman, which is a lot of the world, essentially don't believe that the system is working for them.
4/5?
4/5. That's a terrible number.
High number.
That's 80%.
Yeah, right? That's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's a big number. And so it's predictable, by the way, that we had Wall Street sit in, and we had Me Too, and we had Black Lives Matter. This is the point I was saying, it was predictable, because essentially a host of people, the thing's not working for them, right? And it's across the board. So, you know, people don't believe that the police are making them safer. People don't believe the legal system is fair. People worry about, am I paying my fair share of taxes? People worry about, is the education system creating the graduates we need? Am I going to not have a job in the back end? And the thing that, to me, that's really important about this one, and I think it's the most important of the 4 in a way, is institutions of the kind I just described are like water to fish, right? Yeah. You don't see them, you don't know them, and actually you want them to be invisible. But if they aren't working, you die, right? And if you're a fish, and if the institutions don't work, society starts to crumble. And so the fact that we don't trust our institutions If we don't take that one on in the next decade, the heat that we're seeing right now will just get hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter, and eventually something pretty unhappy will happen.
Yeah, and trust. I mean, that's a tough one.
Yes.
So when you're working with your leaders, do you have leaders who are trying to do a better job of building trust with their teams?
Completely. Yeah. So I think I talked about institutional trust, right? But it starts with individuals. I mean, it turns out that if you take the leadership problem I just described, you cannot fix institutions, you can't repair the impact of technology, and you can't deal with the disparity issue unless you're trusted.
Yep.
And there's a lot of things eroding trust right now, right? So a couple of pieces of advice that we apply to ourselves. One of them is be consistent and stay true to your values and know what they are. Right. And so use your purpose and your values in every decision you take, and explain that you're doing that. Right. Be pretty transparent about why you're doing what you're doing. Be very self-reflective and self-aware, and know who you are and the impact you're having on people. Right. And be transparent and pretty open. That's hard, by the way. It's showing that you're unsure is a tough thing for a leader to do.
Yeah, and I suppose most leaders are not trained to do that, right? I mean, you're supposed to have the answers, be the smart one that everybody turns to. You can't admit that you can't do something, otherwise people are going to think you're not a good leader.
Yeah, that's the dilemma. So you have to be able to exude confidence and create confidence, but also show fragility. It's a tough act, but back to paradox.
Yeah, exactly. So I suppose the best piece of advice for leaders who want to do a better job of building trust is start by being or showing some humility and vulnerability with your teams, and then kind of build that connection.
And sincerity.
Sincerity.
Yes. Humility, humility, empathy, and sincerity. So think about just do COVID for a minute. Think about the leaders you trust in COVID, right? And I'm willing to bet that they were highly empathic, but quite definitive at the same time.
Yeah.
Right. They were inclusive, what we would call humble, right? But they were courageous enough to take the decision when a decision needed to be taken. Right. And that's a hard thing, because just think of it for a minute. So one of the really good leaders was Angela Merkel, right? She sought input from all sorts of people from all walks of life to decide what to do. I'm sure when she got that input, she sat and said, there's no right answer here. I have no idea what the answer is, but she took it anyway, right? And had the courage to take it. So be courageous at the same time that you're humble and you're inclusive and you're sincere.
So from these four, so we have prosperity, tech, inability to lead, and trust. I think in your book, you guys also have a framework, the ADAPT framework, right?
Yes.
So maybe we can go through that in the few minutes that we have left, because that's something that I suppose, can organizations apply that framework in individuals, or is it?
What it is, it essentially was the way we got to those four crises, right? Was we interviewed people from all over the world and said, what are you worried about, right? And the same five things came up again and again and again, and we summarize that in ADAPT. And so ADAPT are the worries that essentially were the harbingers of the crises. So asymmetry, disruption, age, populism, and distrust, right? And so they were essentially the way to think about that is that a taxi driver is worried about the same things that the prime minister is worried about, different level of analysis, but it's the same five things. And the heat's gone up on them as well, but they are sort of the harbingers of the crisis. The other thing to think about is, what's the solution, right?
Yeah. What is the solution?
So because that's the second half of the book, right? So the key piece to it is, if it's the case that these simple ideas of globalization, technology, and simple measures, what we call financialization, were the cause, one half of the solution is to create institutions and a culture that supports, let's be really good locally before we worry about being strong globally. Local first, right? Let's actually worry about the unintended consequences of technology as we're designing it, and humanize technology designing it. And then let's actually ensure that we have broader, more comprehensive measures. So as we're looking at success and we're strategize to a more inclusive, more interdependent world. I just said a mouthful, by the way, because essentially what I said is you were asking at the start of the conversation, what got you into Fuqua? It turned out at Fuqua, we taught globalization, technology, and financialization for every year of my career. So we're saying to people, rethink the entire model and make it more balanced. The problem is there's a set of issues that are so urgent that we can't wait for that to get fixed, right? And there are two for me in particular. One of them is we've got to get our arms around climate faster than we have, and we've got to create small business at scale really fast. And those two, I would say, we need a massive, fast solution for. Nice thing is COVID taught us how to do massive fast. So there's some simple principles we can apply.
So what would be those principles? And also why should leaders listening to this care about climate change or small business? They might say, that's not my responsibility. I just got to worry about my workforce, my P&L. I don't need to think about that stuff. That's like government stuff. That's somebody else's responsibility.
Exactly. So let's do climate first. So the first thing is you're going to be forced to get to net zero, like it or not, because the policy world is going to make you go there. And so you might as well do it. And by the way, your investors care about it. So there was this, just before COVID occurred, there was this massive movement among the investor community to worry about sustainability as a factor in business. That's going to escalate every year that things get hotter and worse. That's going to escalate. The second point, though, is really practical, which is there are physical risks associated with climate. So let's imagine you hold real estate in downtown Miami and the first floor is underwater. You kind of care about it now, right? Let's imagine you're in California and your property sits in front of a mudslide. Let's imagine you own timber and it's under fire. Let's imagine. And so every business in the world has physical risks associated with climate, and every year they're going to get worse. And so if you don't care about the long-term future of your business, as in 1 or 2 or 3 years, don't worry about it. If you don't care about your investor community, don't worry about it. If you don't care about actually the pressure that's going to come on you anyway, don't worry about it. But I think it's here now and today, right? And it'll be forgotten a bit because balance sheets are pretty damaged and we have to recover from it. But as soon as people can turn their attention away from COVID, climate's going to come back with a vengeance. Yep. Now, the small business one is important on 2 counts. The first is, for many businesses, small business is the first step in your supply chain. And if they're damaged, your supply chain is. And by the way, you're going to be forced to localize your supply chain in many cases because for national security and resilience reasons, we're going to force people to localize. You're going to have to rebuild that. And that starts with your 4th tier supplier is a small business, right? The second one is it's your customer in the end. If it turns out that a small business doesn't come back, employment doesn't come back, and the people who buy your products don't come back, and so your total opportunity is whatever number of small business failures there is, that take that percentage off your revenue stream on a forward-looking basis.
So will impact the bigger companies as well.
Completely.
Yeah, most people I don't think about it from that perspective. They just think about kind of the day-to-day aspects.
So part of the reason is that there's a difference between for a long time, what was happening is we were aggregating small businesses into bigger businesses, right? So there's half as many publicly traded companies today as there were 15 years ago. A large reason for that is scale. The other reason is it moved to private, right? But a large reason for that is the firms are huge, right? We were talking about firms worth near trillions of dollars, right? That's pretty big, and they're massive in their impact. So I think the important point though is that eventually that runs its course, and you've eaten your tail, and you no longer have a customer, right? Eventually that runs its course, and there are too many towns that don't have enough financial wherewithal and not enough people who can buy your product. Eventually that runs the course. And so it's back to my point, which is great idea for the first 70 years. The next 70 years, not so good an idea.
Yeah. And that's when it becomes even worse.
Yes.
So maybe before we wrap up, we can talk about some tips that leaders might be able to implement maybe right after they're done listening to this podcast or watching it. So let's say they just finished. Are there like some tips, maybe 3 to 5 things that leaders can start to put into place, some actions that they can start doing to kind of move things forward?
Yeah. So the first is look at the direct implications for your company of climate risk and the need to get to net zero. Look at the direct implication of your company of can you actually compete in a platform-based world? Are you ready to compete? And if so, do you understand what you might be doing that you didn't mean to do? Take a look at whether or not you're prepared for the pressures toward localization we're going to see. And then have you dealt with the workforce issues associated with those 3 things? There's the kind of strategic issues. That's part 1, right? Part 2 is look at yourself and your leadership team, and are you ready for what I just described? And have you made the investments you need to deal with it, and be able to compose a team probably of people who are very different from you and respect that difference. So one of the ways to resolve a paradox. So if you're a great technologist, hire somebody who actually gets how human systems work. If you're really good at people, make sure you got a technologist talking in your ear, but respect them. We usually don't respect the thing we're not good at, right? So that's the second piece. Then I think the third piece is pick a place you care about and make it better. Pick something that is really important in the firm and change it faster than you've ever done before. So one of the cool things that COVID's done is it's taught us we can do things overnight. And what's kind of nice is if you say, I'm going to solve this problem in the next 2 weeks, all the bureaucracy disappears, right? All the reasons you stop doing something disappear because you just blow through it, right? Now, it had better really matter. It better be something that really, really matters. You better be willing to bet the farm on it. You better be willing to do all the things necessary to make it happen, but do it. And then the other piece I was describing is step outside the firm, find a place you care about and make it better.
So when you say find a place you care about,
the city, the town, the village, the county,
so actually like a location.
Location. I mean, location you care about, make it better. And you can say, Blair, why does that matter for business? The answer is, if you are working on making something in the world that's physical geography better, it will force you to think about all the things you're not thinking about today that are important for your business. And then when someone comes back and says, you're the bad guy, you're not. Right? Because you're actually working the issue, right? And so it has 2 positive benefits. You actually are helping. And so if I go back to your question, one of our leaders has said, I'm going to worry about Black Lives Matters and diversity. And they did it before it was a big issue, right? And I think that taught a lot to us as a firm. And it actually puts us in a position where we're kind of on the right side of the balance sheet when people start judging how you're doing. Right. And everyone should do that.
It's a very unconventional tip. I haven't heard anybody say that before. So find something that you care about or a place you care about and try to make it better, whether it's, I guess this could be anything, right? Whether it's volunteering, whether it's...
But really make it better. Don't fake it, right? Go after it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, so that's why I say a place you care about. If you care about it, make it better, right? And go after it. Because too many people play at doing something that matters. And if you work on doing something that matters, what happens is you'll see all the ways in which you're missing things in your business, right? So it teaches you a ton of life lessons.
So what's an example of finding a place and trying to make it better? Like maybe somebody's listening to this and they're like, okay, I really like San Francisco. I really like Alameda where I live. How do I make it better?
So find the thing in the place that's not working, right? So I'll give you a specific example from the book, right? So the town I live in, when we first got here, was really in desperate need of help, right? Durham, North Carolina. The downtown was hollowed out. We had 2 school systems. The city system that was primarily African American, the county system, and the school system was not very good. We'd had this really successful set of middle-class Blacks and Black businesses, but they had this community we paved over with a highway. We just sort of tore it apart, right? And so it was a pretty unhappy place. And then what occurred is a guy from Raleigh actually said, I care about the city. And he went back and said, what are the bad things? What are the things we think about are the problems? So the tobacco business that built Durham, right? And we had a movie that we were famous for, but a pretty lousy baseball team, right? So he said, let's take the things we think about as bad and turn them into a positive narrative. So we took the tobacco warehouse the Duke family started their business in, completely remade it. It's one of the coolest places you've ever seen. And it connected the downtown with the wealthy west side of the town. And then we built a baseball stadium and upgraded the baseball team. And so the two things that were kind of the negative narrative that we thought of with ourselves and became kind of rallying cries as a positive story. We brought them into the 21st century, right? And so find what's not working, find the negative narrative, and figure out how to turn that into a positive story for the place you care about.
I love it. I think that's really cool advice. Well, Blair, where can people go to learn more about you and grab your book?
Well, they can go to any of the sites that sell books. If they go to the PwC Global website, right on that website, there is a book. And if they want to look at Blair Sheppard, 10 Years to Midnight, it will send them to a PwC site that describes it and probably a place to go buy the book. There's a bunch of other stuff we've written, and you'll find it when you go to those same locations.
Very cool. Well, Blair, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak with me.
Thanks for talking, and I'm sorry for the whatever happened in the computer that stopped the system from working.
It happens. Well, thanks again, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Again, my guest has been Blair Sheppard. Make sure to check out his book. It's called 10 Years to Midnight: 4 Urgent Global Crises and Their Strategic Solutions. And I will see all of you next time.
Thanks a lot.